Now we have 30 minutes for questions. Who wanted to start? So while you're still thinking about your questions, just for your information, the B20 added a couple of more recommendations. One of them actually is on land rights. So they really wanted to make sure that the land investment will be accountable, socially responsible. So the one item they added. They also added another one on sustainable development. It's very broad. Save water, save energy, and save land for future use. Okay, David. Introduce yourself.
David Diliman. I'm a professor in Berkeley, and I'm visitor Maximo and David Lavorde, and working with IFPRI. I was really surprised when people spoke that no one mentioned the problem of regulation in agriculture, and in particular a regulation of some new technologies like GMO. People know that this is area that I've been working on, but we have shown that that already prices of corn and soybean went down by about 20 or 30% because of Roundup Ready soybean, and the fact that we don't have a lot of the molecular technologies available for fruits and vegetables, and their use has been curtailed in Africa and developing countries, increased food prices significantly. So if we look at easy solutions and increase productivity, I think that we shoot ourselves in the foot when we don't consider these options. So I'd like to see what the panel thinks about it.
Okay, well, thank you, David. In fact, the B20 recommendation have one particular recommendation on improving enabling environment, so intellectual property rights and or new technologies, but they're very subtle. They didn't mention GMO, just for purpose. Anyway, so any other questions before we ask the panel to address? Okay, Emma.
Thanks very much. Simmons, independent consultant. I have a question about Amos. It has been put forward as kind of one of the great results of the French round of G20. And yet, one would think, in fact, this is not in the interest of the private sector. This is what they trade on. And as Maximo just gave the example from Russia, wrong information going into Amos could actually increase volatility rather than reduce it. That is, if people gave information about potential reserves or actions and then changed their minds, in fact, that could lead to some instability. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about why Amos is such a great idea and why it will work.
Thank you, Emmy. A hand from this side. Here's one.
Actually, have two questions. My name is Marie Brill. I'm with ActionAid here in the United States. And the first one kind of sparks off of Mr. Offenheiser's presentation. We share some of the same concerns about what we would like to see in terms of G8 and G20 addressing core drivers, and was really struck that, IFPRI, Oxfam, ActionAid, many have suggested that commodity speculation, biofuels, climate have all been pieces of those core drivers. To some extent, we're seeing some movement perhaps on addressing commodity speculation, but the big missing gap is biofuels. And so just curious to hear a little bit more, especially from Mr. Glauber, about whether or not there could be any hope that biofuels would be addressed again this year. And if we can move beyond studies, as suggested is needed by Oxfam, to be able to really grapple with the issue going forward. And then on the second question on land, one of the concerns that we have is that we've had great success at civil society coming together and engaging productively with governments to create the voluntary guidelines through the CFS. But what we have found is that G20 and G8 proclamations, of course, trump anything that could come through the CFS when it comes down to final negotiations. And that if we continue to move forward in G20 and G8 places around sort of concretizing what those areas of responsible agricultural investment would look like if it becomes, for example, the 7 principles put forward by the PRAI. It might be difficult for that process that had started with the VGs to be able to continue going forward. So any suggestions about what might the land section might look like coming out of G20 and G8 and how that might influence the ability to have a really strong and engaged process in negotiating around land would be helpful.
Well, thank you, Marie. This seminar is live streamed, so we have a question from one of our audience in the live stream.
We have a question from Phil Thornton, who's a journalist with Emerging Markets newspaper, and he asks, how concerned are you by the impact that rising prices will have on poverty and hunger in Asia, and what, if anything, can ministers at the Asian Development Bank meetings do that would alleviate that situation and contribute towards a long-term solution led by the G20? Then we have a second.
Oh.
And the second question is from Jose Vivero Pol, who's from Belgium, and he asks, considering the failure of the Doha round on agriculture and the urgent need to regulate food production, food trade, and food access at a global level, would it be feasible to propose the launch of negotiations for a new and binding food treaty?
All right, so 5 questions here related to GMO, Amos, biofuels, land, the impact of global food security, poverty, hunger, particularly in Asia, and as well as the trade issues. So maybe Joe, why don't you start first?
Okay.
Some of the tough questions you can. Amos is one. And,
yeah, let me take a couple of these questions. It's not on. There it is. Okay. In terms of Amos, I think that you're right. First of all, of course, FAO prior to this was already putting out market reports. I think what this effort, in one sense, is trying to do is improve that process a lot. I think there was a whole effort or discussion within the G20 whether or not to create a separate entity, and I think everyone agreed no, it should be at FAO. I know a number of countries just over the last 6 months have been providing data, and the Secretariat for Amos has been working on those countries that haven't yet provided data to do so. They're also taking as input the data USDA puts out, the so-called PS&D database, which has individual country level estimates that we put out monthly in terms of production and consumption and trade. I think it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but I think it is going to. I think it will lead to improved market information. I've sat in on a number of the discussions that the Secretariat's had with countries in terms of bringing better data to the table. Someone mentioned the problem of the fact that reserves, many of one of the big weaknesses, of course, is reserve data. And there, I think the hope is if we identify weaknesses that are due to capacity issues, that then we can address those by putting, helping countries, through capacity building and to improve stock data and other things. I mean, I think those are real key things and key points. But I think ultimately, the idea is, and particularly what's important is the tie into the Rapid Response Forum. I mean, if you think back to 2008 with the case of rice, where we had ample world supplies of rice, it wasn't an issue where we, like wheat was in 2007, where we had very, very short stocks. Rice, there were ample supplies, but through a whole combination of factors that were exacerbated by export bans, all of a sudden we were in a very, very tight situation in terms of what was traded. And I think again, something like an Amos could have helped by at least trying to calm waters and say, no, there are ample supplies of rice available. And hopefully I look at this Rapid Response Forum as frankly the biggest benefit that I think it will have is providing better information so that people aren't alarmed by the world situation. Let me just touch on a couple of the other issues, and these I think I'll probably be on the opposite side, or at least have some disagreements with Ray. One, speculation. I think that as far as I know, there was disappointment on the part of some that there wasn't more in the Ag Action Plan last year. That was clearly seen as something speculation, or the whole issue of speculation was being treated by the financial work stream of G20, and I think that there was a lot of people were in agreement that the Ag ministers themselves shouldn't be looking at that if it were being looked at by the finance ministers. But secondly, and I think more importantly, is the fact that at least my own view, I mean, is that yes, there may be a transparency issue, and it's all important to improve transparency, but speculation in and of itself, I don't think is a problem. And to the contrary, I think that if you look at the long history of agricultural markets, lack of speculation actually has been a far bigger issue. That is when markets are thin and there aren't people on the other side of the market, that we tend to get distortions in individual prices. And I think that a lot of empirical studies, and I'd say the bulk of empirical studies that have been done on the issue of speculation, have shown no impacts on absolute price levels. That in a short period of time there may be a blip due to some speculative activity, but in the end, the fundamentals of those markets tend to guide prices, and I think that that's something to consider. And I think that over-regulating markets actually could be of very serious consequence. In terms of biofuels, there's no question mandates and subsidies, they distort markets. There's, I think, but the other important aspect of the biofuel market to remember is the fact that it is very much tied to energy markets. And the fact is, when you have prices, crude oil prices going over $100 a barrel, there's a lot going on in those markets that are going to create strong incentives to turn biomass into energy. And I mean, just a good case in point is what's going on in the U.S. market right now. Under the mandates, we've essentially under the renewable fuel standard, we've essentially achieved the maximum amounts of corn that can be put into the system. There may be another billion or so gallons, but essentially we've been producing at 13.5, 14 billion gallons with a cap in those mandates at 15 billion. And the subsidies and secondary tariffs on those have been eliminated. So essentially any additional ethanol that's produced will be very much at those mandated levels. I mean, we're producing at this point without subsidies, and those are the excess ethanol is actually being exported. And why is that? Is because there is demand for energy, and ethanol is traded at about a dollar discount to gasoline these days. So there are strong incentives to blend that into fuel.
Probably will come back
to
some of the issues the audience raised. I think another value of the Amos is to avoid a panic purchase. I think Joe mentioned about export bans. But during 2007, 2000, the food crisis, certain importing countries actually were really panic. So they went to the market to purchase the food at any price. That actually further exacerbated the global food prices. Now, Ray, obviously, very natural. Now you should respond next, particularly a debate among panel members. One question I have to you is how the civil societies like yours can really make the private sector and government be accountable to what they have said or what they have committed. This is some of the issues we are struggling with. Ray.
Well, maybe I'll take that one and then maybe I'll offer a few other comments as well. I mean, I think the global food price crisis, I think, was a wake-up call for civil society in 2008, and I think there's been a lot of organizing and collaboration amongst civil society groups all over the world that's come as a consequence of that, and I think we've taken a deeper dive into the into the maybe many of the serious sort of structural issues in the sector that we perhaps, I think, fairly enough, we're not paying enough attention to. I mean, I think it was really interesting that the world, in some sense, was caught off guard by the depletion of stocks globally. That, you know, in some sense, is at the basis of the crisis, and the fact that, you know, we've still got a steep climb to renew those stocks. And maybe just speaking to the question of, you know, the importance of the data collection and Amos or the FAO systems. I mean, I think on the part of civil society organizations, what we're looking for is how can we avoid a situation where we're not paying attention again in the way we were in 2008, and we somehow missed the fact that those stocks were depleting, and that would in fact potentially have some impact on global prices in the way that it actually did. So recognizing that none of these systems are perfect, I guess one of the values I think that civil society is trying to promote in advancing this agenda, if I can return to your question, Schengen, is greater degree of transparency in the market for all of the different elements that are sort of at play here. And I think Joe and I may disagree on the speculation question, but I've attended other events at the World Bank and the IMF where there is sort of an admission that we can't quite sort of assess all of this effect, but there's a feeling that there's something going on here that's, you know, that's not normal and that we need to pay attention to, and that if there's some way we could regulate excessive trading and excessive speculation, it might not be a bad thing if we're concerned about ensuring access to food and reasonable prices for global populations. On how we do that, you know, is it regulation in the financial markets? I mean, to some degree, Dodd-Frank helps a little bit with this in terms of addressing some of the you know, trying to get some of the hedge funds and derivatives kind of a little bit more out in the sunshine, as it were, and therefore, you know, providing the kind of data that we might need to track these markets. But I think, as our other panelists have said, this is the sort of thing that has to be embraced not by just by the United States, but by other members of the G20 as well. The other thing I think, Schengen, that's happening at the national level in many countries, and Oxfam's, you know, really trying to sort of work on this, is to what degree can we work in countries that have been faced with food price or the effects of sort of the food price crisis to actually empower civil society to engage their governments to increase investments in the agricultural sector and make that a high priority and part of national plans. And many of our organizations are working with domestic not-for-profit organizations in country trying to do a better job of analyzing what the needs are, what kind of investments, what's the current investment pattern, how that can be enhanced. In Africa, as you know, many the African nations have committed to actually increasing their commitments to 10% of their budgets on an annual basis invested in the agricultural sector, and you know, we think that's fundamentally a good thing. And what we're doing is trying to track to what degree these governments are actually delivering on that. In terms of the private sector, I think many of us have recognized that foreign direct investment in agriculture is going to be an increasingly dominant sort of feature of the 21st century, and that foreign aid as a percent of sort of what's going to impact the agricultural sector is important, but it's going to be tracking with private sector investment. And I think the question for us is, how do we engage the private sector in a discussion about what sustainability actually means? What does good land use mean? In terms of these kinds of questions about these voluntary guidelines, for example, does it make sense to be displacing smallholder agriculturalists in favor of large-scale palm oil plantations for ethanol? You know, you're probably finding civil society organizations lining up around the world, basically trying to challenge what, you know, the private sector's wisdom in terms of, and government's wisdom in terms of, you know, devoting land to that as opposed to ensuring domestic food security. So I think there's civil society is, on the one hand, I think, trying to figure out how to intelligently engage the state in terms of its agricultural investment priorities, and on the other hand, engaging the private sector through a variety of existing fora. There's a whole bunch of different fora on commodity roundtables and other fora where the private sector is actually dialoguing actively with civil society on many of these issues. And I think it's in those fora that these sustainability questions are actually being debated.
Well, thank you, Ray. Maximo, can you probably just pick up one or two questions very briefly, then we can go to another one to save some time for the second
on David Silverman's comment, David, there was no discussion on specific technologies. There was more discussion on how to exchange international property rights and how to improve the communication between science and the technologies that are already there and how to create platforms to share those technologies. So there was some issues on creating, having better information on regulatory policies, but again, that requires a lot of capacity building at the country level too. So that was not part of the IO, at least IO paper. On the issue of Amos, I agree with what Joe have said. I don't think the data that comes into Amos is just going automatically out. The data goes through a process of double checking and so on and consistency. So the better we can get information on existing reserves and on thresholds, on how to model those indicators to identify thresholds, I think will be value added. It's not only the case of rice in 2007, 2008, it was also the case of wheat when the Russian export bans, and many other situations where we saw a lot of media on problems. In Mozambique, prices are going up because of food, which has nothing to do with food. So having good information that was not available in that moment to the world, I think reduces that asymmetry of information, which is pretty important. And just to stop, two small things. I don't think the G20 can block the CFS guidelines. I don't see how, at least in my experience there, I don't see how that, even what I saw in the IO's report and in the supposed potential future action plan is to support those rather than to go against those. So I don't see a problem there. I see more on the problem of the implementation of those guidelines and how you will create capacities in the countries to be able to implement them, because they are pretty generic. So how you bring them to reality, that is where I see the biggest problem. And on the speculation, just simple, speculation is good because it creates liquidity to the markets. Excessive could be a problem, and we need to look at it. But what was clear to us, at least because we were the ones saying in 2007 that there was a period where we identified some periods of excessive speculation. We couldn't find the same later on in the 2010-11 crisis. But there was, of course, an increase in the volume of transactions in the futures market, and which, of course, can put pressure, like a central bank increase velocity, and you put pressure and you can create inflation. The problem to us is that regulation by itself not necessarily will resolve the problem, and it could create a problem of liquidity. And that's our concern. And that's why our recommendation, IFPRI recommendation, at least in that point, was we need to be very careful. It's not just an issue of Chicago regulating. And already there have been some changes in the regulatory policies of derivative markets in the US. But if the EC doesn't create its own regulatory policies that are harmonized with the US, I don't see any real effect of that regulation. And that's where the financial group is working, but I still don't see something coming up of a harmonization of policies to push. So then we need to look to other risk coping mechanisms that can help to resolve those problems.
Okay, can we have second round? David? Okay, and you? Any other hands here? Right, David here in the front. Why would you pass the microphone?
Thank you, David Lambert. To the question of why agricultural research budgets continue to be so anemic by any analysis, could it be that we do not give it a human face? We do not tell the story in human terms. Agriculture serves a lot of purposes in our society, but ultimately is its purpose not nutrition and human health? And our ag research budgets are 1% to 2% of our biomedical research budgets. And what's so paradoxical about that is when you look at the priorities of agricultural research, they are all about taking pressure off the biomedical research budgets. Global food security, bioenergy, climate change, nutrition, obesity, food safety. So I would appreciate any reaction to that.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Schmidt. I work at the German Embassy, and I'm interested in the question how we could link the G20 countries with the non-G20 countries. If we look at the G20 countries, we mainly have highly intensive agricultural systems. And if we look at least at the needy non-G20 countries, which we have in focus if we talk about developing countries, they very often have low intensity agricultural systems. So there are two different sets of economics, of production condition, and so on. And that is, I think that's a basic problem. And then there is in addition, the question, how could we link that on the organizational, institutional level? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Bob, did you have a Did you have your hands up? No, if not, oh, you did. Okay, right.
Yeah. I guess with respect to the question of speculation, it was all with respect to futures markets, I understood. But I don't know any speculator that wants a unit trade load of corn arriving on Wall Street. Those contracts are all zeroed out at the end of the contract. So I guess I fail to see, based on that, how there can be lasting effect of speculation on market prices. The other question relates to research, and you present, or Maximo, you presented two slides, one after the other, with the declining rate of growth in productivity, and then the decline in or flattening out of investments in research, but didn't really associate causality from one to the other. And I think that misses a great opportunity to emphasize the importance of greater investment in research if we want to turn that flattening out of productivity growth around. It didn't just happen. It happened to a significant extent because of the decline in investments, particularly in productivity-enhancing research.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Joe, you presented this long-term trend of agriculture research investment in U.S. Trend is flat, but there's another dimension that is a priority within that trend. The U.S. has spent more money on natural resource management at the cost of productivity enhancement. Not only affected U.S. food production, but also global food production and food security through price channel, through technology transfer. And I also agree with some panel members said that capacity building in helping some of the G20 countries can really make the Amos more effective, more efficient. If you ask Indians to report their stock, their price, based on certain time schedule, they will not be able to do that. They don't have the capacity to do it. So some of the G20 countries can help other countries to build the capacity. Anyway, so now I ask the panels to address some of the questions from Ray, maybe this time you can, do you have anything to respond to the three questions raised?
The agricultural budget question. I mean, I guess I wondered when I sort of look at the trajectory of financing in the World Bank and USAID and the diminished funds in agriculture as just one example of how we were funding or not funding agricultural research internationally. Part of the logic there was that that we in some sense had an agricultural system that was going to provide cheap food for the world for the foreseeable future, and that it was really all about the markets, and that we could move on to other issues beyond agriculture. And now I think that logic is sort of caught up with us, and we're realizing that it's important to reinvest in agriculture again, because perhaps that hypothesis didn't bear itself out in reality. And so, so in our particular case, we're really championing reinvestment in agriculture R&D as something we think is extraordinarily important, both in the G20 countries as well as in reestablishing the national agricultural research capacity in many of the poorer countries as well. On the issue of, I thought this question about the link between the G20 countries and their model of economics and agriculture and that of many of the poor nations a really interesting one. And I think it really, this discussion about what sustainability means in those contexts versus what it might mean in our own G20 context is a really important one that I think certainly civil society organizations are going to be very much focused on, and probably the sort of the narrative that you will hear is going to be, how do we remember that much of the agriculture in these countries is anchored in smallholder agriculture, and that these countries in many ways have there's considerable productive potential there, and it may be the case that there's a lot we can learn from those agricultural systems that we have not invested in over the years. The CG system I've been associated with for a long time, and I have a great deal of respect for it. But I think there's there may be technologies and there may be approaches to agriculture in that traditional systems that we could actually invest in and improve productivity levels without necessarily introducing high-intensity mechanized agriculture. And on the speculation questions, I'm going to leave that to my colleagues who are more invested in the research on that question.
Right. Maximum.
A few answers. In terms of the investment, the productivity link, and I didn't talk about causality because, for me to be able to talk about causality, I need to have a pretty detailed study in which I can really show you causality. I just show some stylized facts and some graph. But for me, there are three issues which are important in investment. One is investment in core research, which that takes time and has a long-term return. And that's what I think we have missed enormously in agriculture. And we still are missing. And I think it's essential. And that cannot be done over the night. And especially if we take into account the potential climate change, there is a lot that needs to be done and there is a lot to be thought about it. So that's a problem. The second problem is investment in extension and how to transfer what we know now into the fields, especially in G20 and non-G20 countries, how we improve that. And there is a lot of work being done, but clearly we don't know yet what are the best practices, how we can move them, how we can scale them up. And that's a lack. And the third one, which is not part of the agricultural budgets, is investment in infrastructure for agriculture, which is not only hard infrastructure, but it's also soft, and that's human capital. And that's something that we have forgot a lot. In many of these documents, you know that there is not the human capital, you know that there is an aging population, but there is no recommendation and figure out ways in which we can improve that. And one of the things that, at least in the IO paper, we try to have a recommendation on that, on how to link that which is important. Then on the issue of the different phase to agriculture, I think it's crucial, the idea of building these linkages between agriculture, health, and nutrition. And that's something that CIR is working on with the research program on agriculture, health, and nutrition, which is trying to make the agricultural sector understand that it's not only them, it's also the health sector, and how that could affect nutrition of kids, especially in the first 1,000 days. So bringing that is even important, even for our own triggers, our price volatility triggers, our extreme volatility trigger. Right now we are doing a statistical thresholds. We basically have a very good statistical identification of when is an excessive volatility, but I don't have a face to that. So if I want to argue that financial sector needs to stop, or biofuels needs to stop producing ethanol because they're affecting human lives, I cannot say that. I can only say statistically this is the threshold for excessive. So we are working a lot in trying to link that to what will mean in terms of welfare effects, of loss function of production because of volatility, or loss function and welfare of households. So trying to do that, I think, is very important for policymakers to understand when the triggers are critical. And Schmidt, on your comment on the G20 and non-G20 countries, I think that a lot of the initiatives, at least on the IO paper and the recommendations, are not for G20 countries, although they are the key producers and the key exporters and importers, which is really important. But a lot of recommendations, like the Amos, the role of Amos is, as Chengen was mentioning, is also to try to build the capacities in India to be able to report the quality of data that is needed. It's not only give me the data, it's to help them in trying to do that, although they are part of the G20, but also the Prepare, for example, was for Africa. The Prepare was for West Africa to resolve a problem of access under crises. But we also need to work directly with the regional entities to be able to make this more effective, because then you enter into a competition. Do I have to do it and own it when you have a technical institution that have work on the document and they don't talk to each other? And that's the nightmare, I think, at least that's my frustration in these meetings, is that you spend a lot of time in developing a good document, but then it goes down and they don't implement it because they want to do their own. And that's okay, but they can do it jointly. You understand? So that's where I think we lose a lot of results, because we have this issue of it's mine, it's yours, and things don't move forward. So a lot of them are focused, and what we are working now on the input markets again is trying to resolve a problem. We know that if we build a plant of fertilizers in Nigeria, we'll have a huge effect in terms of prices and access.
Well, thank you, Maximo. Joe, maybe you can briefly touch up on the speculation issues. I think Paul raised a very good question. We briefly need to address his question.
On speculation? I thought I addressed it before.
Well, he's not happy about it. Right.
Yeah, no, I would agree with Bob wholeheartedly. I mean, I think that's right. You will see some changes with, again, day-to-day trades where you may see limit moves, but again, fundamentals rule the day, and fundamentals are part and parcel of the cash market, and that's where I think we see arbitrage taking care of that. Let me just say a couple things about the research side. I think you made an excellent point in talking about peeling back those research dollars and looking at where they actually are going for, because you're absolutely right. Research on productivity itself has declined. I mean, there are a myriad of ways that one can spend money in this area, obviously, and things like post-harvest loss, for example. You know, could that, if the studies are right, that we're losing some 30–40% through post-harvest loss, more research in that area that could improve that, or at least cut those numbers, could be a very big help here. But again, getting back to David's point, I think the real difficult thing, again, is trying to get public support for these dollars. I mean, we just sat last week through a markup session in the Senate for the next Farm Bill, and it's mind-boggling to think that the budget for the next Farm Bill over the next 10 years is $1 trillion. It's about $6 billion short of $1 trillion. $1 trillion. Now, $750 billion of that, or $800 billion of that, is in food stamps and nutrition program spending. But on the other hand, USDA's ag budget for research, you know, $3 to $4 billion, what we're talking about. So you just think annually, and you know, as opposed to some $100 billion annually for all these other programs, just a little bit of money, I think, could go a long way here. Again, and Maximo made a good point. I think that trying to relate that, well, as did Ray, the fact is that it wasn't a problem for a long time. In fact, low prices were seen, at least as far as Congress was concerned, is the problem. That is too much productivity, if you will, and I think that will hopefully change, and that we will see more emphasis there.
Well, thank you.